All right, New Testament. They don't number them anymore. This is the third lesson in the book, but it's called "We Have Come to Worship Him." First time, or one of the first lessons in the new curriculum that took over for the old curriculum that had been cycling through every 4 years for the last 40 years. Um, So exciting there. This one, we have come to worship him. Before we get started on exactly what the lesson is talking about, as I was reading through the manual, the new manual, which is fairly open and vague, it talked a lot about people who sought out Jesus. We have come to worship him, the Magi, and others. But all of the examples, for the most part, were from the life of Jesus. So as I started thinking about that, I started thinking about the day and age that we live in and people seeking Jesus in our day. And I came across a couple of studies, one from England, a couple from North America, that I think kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. The first one, it was research conducted in England by the Church of England, as well as two other nonprofits. The three of them partnered together and hired a research firm. And they asked people a series of questions, just a random sampling of English adults. One of the questions they asked are, what are your beliefs on Jesus Christ? The first response, God in human form, there was only 17% of respondents who said that they believed Jesus Christ was God in human form. 30% said he was a prophet or a spiritual leader, but not God. There was 17% who also thought that he was just a normal human. There was 9% who didn't know, and then there was 2% who said other. And then there were 25%, a full quarter of people that didn't respond. Responses weren't recorded for. And then they said, okay, well, what are your beliefs on the resurrection then? And 17% says it happened as the Bible said it happened. It doesn't say this in the research results, but I would imagine those 17% are the same 17% who believe that Jesus Christ was God in human form. There were 26% who said they believe in the resurrection, but the Bible was not literal. Didn't happen like it said in the Bible. There were 13% who said they do not believe in the resurrection. There were 4% who said they don't know. There was 22% who said Jesus is fictional. And then the remaining 18% said they weren't sure if Jesus was real or not. So looking at that, they said, what is your understanding of Jesus? Was he a real person, whether God or prophet or whatever, a myth, or you don't know? A full 60% of people said that Jesus was a real person, but 22% said he was a myth, and there were 18% who said they weren't sure if he was a real person or a myth. So in Jesus' day, you know, the manual talks about people who sought him out, who recognized who he was. The other people that he came across, obviously there was no argument if he was a real person or not in their mind, because he was standing in front of them, or he was there on the hill, or what have you. But they may or may not have believed that he was the Son of God. In our day and age, we're finding, you know, a gap, a growing number of people, getting close to half of people who either don't know if he was real or not, or believe that he wasn't real, that he was simply a myth. Interesting to think about when we're talking about seeking Jesus. So in this same study, they broke the respondents up by age and asked them if they were Christian. So in the 18 to 24-year-old range, a little over 15% self-identified as Christian. In the 25 to 34 age range, about 20% self-identified as Christian. In the 35 to 44, 18% or so. In 44 to 54, about the same. In 55 to 64, it's about 15%, and then 65 plus was the largest group with over 20% self-identifying as Christians. Now, if you look at these bars, you'll see the darker portion down at the bottom. Those are the ones who answered questions in such a way to where they were grouped in and defined as practicing Christians. Now, the only thing that they had to do in order to be grouped in as practicing Christians was to regularly pray, read the Bible, and attend church at least monthly. And out of all the respondents, only 9% of the respondents could be defined as practicing Christians, and that's the dark bar down at the bottom there, which isn't a huge surprise if you've been following the news and the demographic surveys, because in recent years it has been written a lot about the rise of the nuns. And they call them nun because it's people who check the box for nun on surveys of a religious affiliation. In a 2015 Pew Research Center poll reported that 34 to 36% of millennials, who it defined as those born after 1980, are nuns, and 23% of the total population. That was in 2015, which was quite an increase from in 2007, when only 16% of Americans said they were affiliated with no religion. So we had a 7% jump in about as many years, in 8 years. And that 23% of the total population is 55.8 million people, up from 36.6 million in 2007. So we have almost 56 million people in the U.S. who check the none box on the surveys that ask about religious affiliation. Now, while this is a much smaller number than 71% of Americans who self-identify as Christians, it's still quite a significant group. If you add up the total number of Jews, Muslims, and Buddhists in the U.S. combined, they only equal 8.6 million. Quite a small number compared to the nuns. And if you break out specific Christian sects, the nuns equal or are on par with the evangelicals, which are slightly more, and the Catholics, which are slightly less. So the nuns are definitely a group to watch. They're the up-and-coming group, so to speak. But it's important to note that a lot of these nuns are not necessarily atheists. Many have moved from mainstream religions into New Age spiritual movements. For instance, a couple years after that poll I just referenced, the 2017 Pew poll found an increase from 19% in 2012 to 27% in 2017 of those who reported being spiritual but not religious. Among that cohort, only 37% described their religious identity as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. A study a couple years earlier in 2014 conducted by the Austin Institute for the Study of Family found that of the 13.2% who called themselves atheist in their study or agnostic, 32% of those people answered in the affirmative to the question, do you think there is life or some sort of conscious existence after death? Maybe even more interestingly, 6% of those atheists and agnostics also said they believed in the bodily resurrection of the dead. So even though they were self-identifying as atheist or agnostic, 6% of the people who did that said that they believed that there is some sort of reuniting of the body and spirit, can you say spirit, after the dead. And while these numbers are all very interesting, there's another study that was put out in the January 2018 issue of Social, Psychological, and Personality Science written by two psychologists from the University of Kentucky, entitled "How Many Atheists Are There?" And they concluded that there may be far more atheists than pollsters report because, quote, social pressures favoring religiosity, coupled with stigma against religious belief, might cause people who privately disbelieve in God to nonetheless self-present as believers, even in anonymous questionnaires. So they used something called an unmatched count technique, which has previously been validated and employed for estimating the size of other underreported groups. And they estimated with 93% certainty that somewhere between 17 and 35% of Americans are atheists, with a most credible indirect estimate of 26%. 26%. If that's true, that means there are more than 64 million American atheists. Just under 1 in 5, like around in between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people. That means on an average day, out of the, every 5 people you talk to, one of them could be an atheist or along those lines. If you go back to the graph that I had earlier, showed the nuns and the other and evangelical and Catholic, that puts the atheists as the largest group in that. Now, this is a very irresponsible representation of this data, because those atheists are ones who may have self-identified as something else, so there's probably duplicity in this data, and some of the nuns, evangelicals, Catholics maybe even are an atheist. But I threw it up there to just kind of prove the point that as we think about seeking Jesus, it's something we should all be aware of, right? And when we talk about seeking Jesus, the manual mainly talked about us, ourselves. And we all have to work out our own salvation. We all have to come to Jesus on our own terms. But we all have to be aware of what's going on around us and be aware that there's people who we may be able to help, who may need our help. And it's kind of our responsibility to reach out. And so we have 27% of American population who are nuns, but they're spiritual but not religious. So they believe in something, but a lot of them it's the structure or the rigidity of organized religion that turns them off to it. 32% of people who self-identified as atheist or agnostic answered in the affirmative to the question, do you think there is life or some sort of conscious existence after death? So there's a number of people there who self-identify as atheist or agnostic and yet still think that something happens after we die. So there is a spiritual aspect to that. And 6% of those said they believed in the bodily resurrection of the dead. Now, going back to the study from England, one of the things that they said, 1 in 5 people who aren't Christians would be happy to learn more about the faith after hearing other Christians talk to them about it. 1 in 5. Similar number to the number of atheists that the psychologists from Kentucky assume are in North America. That's a lot. That's a good number. If when I was on my mission, if I'd have been told that 1 in 5 doors I knocked on would have been somebody interested, it would have made my day. That wasn't played out in my experience, but there's a difference there that we'll talk about in a minute. Dr. Rachel Jordan Wolfe, who was part of that study in England, said they think we're friendly, caring, and good humors, referring to people who are non-Christian. When in that study they asked them what religion they were part of, and if they didn't self-identify as Christian, then they went down a question track where they would ask questions about what's your opinion of Christians, and they responded, they think we're friendly, caring, and good-humored, and they like being around us, which is such great news as Christians to know. We're liked, in fact, we're loved. We think because people grow up in this country, they know that Jesus was a real person. I wonder if we've got complacent or assumed it was the school's job, and actually maybe there's something about us as the church recognizing that we have a clear responsibility to make sure everybody hears about Jesus Christ. what she's saying is, the non-Christians, generally speaking, have a good opinion of the Christians. But the Christians tend to assume that everybody believes Jesus was a real person, when in fact, the study results bear out that only 60% of people believe that Jesus was a real person. The other 40% either think he was a myth or they're not sure if he was real or not. So the responsibility falls on us to help these people understand. Some of these people may actually be seeking answers. The agnostics and the atheists who believe that something happens after life, they may be seeking answers, similar to the Magi that the lesson manual brings up and that we mentioned at the beginning. We don't really know a whole lot about these guys. The Magi, the term, comes from Matthew, the words, the Greek words that Matthew uses to describe them, and in Thayer's Greek dictionary defines them as the name given by the Babylonians, Medes, Persians, and others to the wise men, teachers, priests, physicians, astrologers, seers, interpreters of dreams, augurs, soothsayers, sorcerers, etc. So it seems to be kind of a catch-all phrase, which makes it, when you're looking through the lens of history, incredibly difficult to really determine who they were and what they were doing. But there's no question that they must have studied Jewish scriptures, as they recognized the signs of several prophecies and made the journey to go in search of the newborn king. They wouldn't have been there on the night of his birth. Matthew uses the Greek word paidion, I'm not sure how to say it, which means child or toddler, to describe Jesus, not the word baby. And of course, we don't know how many there were. There were 3 different gifts. But as we think about the data that I just presented in our missionary work and people who we could talk to about Jesus, the Magi likely were men of means, because they had the means to give expensive gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But they also had the means to travel a long distance and deliver those in person. So when we're thinking about people who are seeking Jesus, are we looking over the people who have means and assuming that they have everything that they need and not maybe reaching out to them? I think the Magi are a good example of people who have means and yet are still seeking Jesus. As I flip through my New Testament thinking about other people who sought Jesus, one guy that came to mind was Nicodemus. Nicodemus is named as a ruler of the Hoi Ledoi. I don't know how to say it. We don't know for sure. It's impossible to really say, but it's probable that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was a Jewish ruling council whose limited authority was sanctioned by the Roman government. But in John 7, we read when he was questioning his fellow members of that council about Jesus' arrest, he was questioned for his loyalty. Now, interestingly, in ancient Judaism, there were several rituals which marked stages of the life cycle, beginning with birth and circumcision and continuing on to ordination, various levels of Jewish leadership, and so on, which is why, or could be why, Jesus used the phraseology that he did, that you must be born again. Interestingly enough, Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus is the only time in the New Testament that Jesus mentions or anybody talks about the need to be born again. This man, Nicodemus, who was a part of, we assume was part of a group that kind of made the rules for the most part, and were known to be very religious, he sought out Jesus. And because he did that, we have an exchange that, excuse the pun, birthed an entire theology that is a major part of Christianity today. The whole idea of being born again comes from this man who from the outside looking at him, people would think he understood and had a handle on religion and spirituality. He was part of the leading group, and yet he sought out Jesus, and because of that, we have this great conversation about being born again. Another one, actually one of my most favorite stories in the Bible, the rich young man. And the reason I love this story so much is because this guy is me. I keep the commandments, and yet I'm not willing to sell all that I own. I wish I was, but I'm not willing to sell all that I own and give to the poor and follow Jesus. I think about it a lot. Wish I was. But this young man, again, like Nicodemus or like the wise men, from the outside looking in, you may think he has everything he needs, right? He's wealthy. He's even called a ruler at one point, so maybe he had some sort of political standing or something in addition to his wealth. And he keeps all the commandments. He's very pious. He's a righteous dude. So looking at him, people may think, well, he has everything he needs. There's no reason to talk to him about it. And yet he is seeking Jesus. He goes, he finds Jesus, and he says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And after he answers Jesus that he keeps all the commandments, Jesus looked at him and loved him and said, "One thing you lack. Go sell everything you have, give to the poor. You will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." So here we have three examples of people who, from the outside looking in, seem like they've got it together, seem like they probably, have most of the answers worked out. And yet all three of them were seeking Jesus. So when we take that and we go back to the research that I cited earlier, and we look at the answers from the non-Christians, we find that 54% of non-Christians who know a Christian say they have never had a conversation about Christ with that person. More than half of non-Christians who know you and know you're a Christian would say they have never had a conversation about Christ with you. Now, maybe that's because we're shy, maybe that's because we're insecure, or maybe that's because we're looking at them and think, oh, they've got it all worked out. They know what they're doing. They got a good life going on. And so I don't need to share it with them. They're not going to be interested in what I have to say. Maybe that's not true. Maybe we should rethink those assumptions. Even more interesting to me is 64% of people who are 45 to 54 years old, so people who have lived about half a century, 64% of them have never had a conversation about Christ with a practicing Christian. Now, practicing Christian, by the definition of this study, was prays regularly, reads the Bible, attends church at least once a month. So these folks who have lived 50 years, 64% of them have never had a conversation about Christ with a practicing Christian. And then finally, 20% of non-Christians, 1 in 5, said they were open to discussing and learning more about Christ. So, if anything, in this lesson, the one takeaway should be, we need to open our mouths more. We need to reach out, even to people who we may think wouldn't be interested because of their wealth, because of their knowledge, maybe because they're members of a different faith and we don't think they would be interested. Research shows that, maybe not all of them would be interested, but a lot of them would be interested. And research shows that non-Christians generally have very good opinions of Christians. So it's unlikely that you would offend them, make them mad, lose a friendship. But the good news of Christ is the most important information that we have. And when 64% of 50-year-old people can say they've never had a conversation about Christ with a practicing Christian, it shows that there's a lot of work to do. Even after 2,000 years, there's still a lot of work to be done. Thank you.